Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot down by a Serbian patriot, and the greatest war the world had known exploded in Europe.
So one of the main points of confusion that surrounds the assassination is the fact that the Black Hand, who are believed to have organised or at least planned and supposedly masterminded the assassination, were a different organisation to Mlada Bosna, the organisation that Gavrilo Princip belonged to. Austria-Hungary, incidentally, had in fact ignited both international and regional tensions in 1908 when it had outright annexed the province of Bosnia-Herzegovina. A lot of this stems from the period 1908, which I would argue can in fact be kind of the inflection point at which we start to see the gradual escalation towards the First World War itself.
From a pistol shot at Sarajevo, the first of the great modern world wars exploded.
The Kaiser's vision was that this was going to be a local war. Franz Joseph and Austria were going to have a short, sharp go at Serbia, and that was going to be that. It was going to be a local war. Wilhelm II did not have the vision that it would become anything as big as it would, even though Franz Ferdinand had warned him that it would.
If Gavrilo Princip had realized the consequences of his action, which went so far beyond an act of violence against two individuals, he likely would not have pulled the trigger, because the consequences of his action, the consequences of the First World War, are still being felt today. It is certainly right to consider the First World War the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century.
Had Franz Ferdinand lived, would there have been a war? There may well have been a war. If there had been a war, the timing would at least have been later.
On top of that, I will also say, in 1914, where were the institutional safeguards? Where was the voice of regular people? I think that's a far more interesting question to ask. Since the late 19th century, both the European great powers as well as smaller independent countries such as Serbia, Greece and Bulgaria faced a myriad of different tensions. In the West, for example, you had what was popularly known as the Franco-German antagonism that originated in the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870s, that had seen the European balance of power gradually pivot towards Germany, whilst over in the East, you have what's often referred to as the ongoing Eastern Crisis, what I term the Long Eastern Crisis, that centred on the continual contraction of the Ottoman Empire. This latter tension in particular had created something of a power vacuum. All of the European great powers were themselves competing to fill or vie for influence in this region, and particularly among the new countries that were emerging in the wake of the Ottoman Empire's contraction. You also have what is essentially an international balance of power that really by 1914 is in a state of near chronic decay.
The key point that really set the stage for the assassination was the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908. It really was the precursor to World War I. Bosnia-Herzegovina was a province that was ruled by Turkey but administered by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, just because the Turks were not that good at administrating their own areas, and also because it helped serve as a buffer between the expansion of Russia in the Turkish area and in the area of the Crimea. So in 1908, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, without actually consulting any other countries, suddenly annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina and upset a lot of Europe. Serbia particularly. Serbia has been looking at expanding and becoming a greater Serbia, taking into countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so Serbia was particularly upset.
And then underneath that, if you like, you've got tensions in the Balkans following the recent Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13. You've got fears in the Ottoman Empire about its future following the losses that it incurred during the Balkan Wars. So really, wherever you look, a sense of a fear really of what the future might hold and whether a war was around the corner. So that's sort of the diplomatic background against which fears of a future war played out. And I think it's important to understand that at this time, every government really expected that there would be a major war in the near future. It wasn't certain when that would be, but everybody felt it was likely to come.
At a more domestic level, nearly every country in Europe as well faces a range of challenges. To give some examples, Britain and Italy, right up until 1914, are experiencing ongoing strikes, industrial and labour unrest. In Italy, this frequently devolves into outright violence and rioting, while in Britain, many of these issues are interlinked with the rising tensions we see in Ireland that would then subsequently break out into sectarian violence, particularly in the form of the Easter Rising of 1916 and the subsequent Irish War of Independence in 1918. So one may talk of the Balkans as being a tinderbox, but in reality, I would certainly argue it's Europe itself that is the tinderbox by 1914.
On the morning of the 28th of June, which was a sunny Sunday, they set out for Sarajevo. Now, the 28th of June is a very important day in Bosnian history. It's something called St. Vitus Day, which commemorates the Battle of Kosovo of 1389, where the Bosnians lost rather dramatically to the Turks. So it's a day that Bosnians are very nationalistic. Nobody bothered to tell Franz Ferdinand that it was St. Vitus Day. Otherwise, I suspect he would not have got in that car.
So the Archduke's motorcade, which consists of 6 limousines, sets off along the Apple Quay. Within the crowds, however, are 6 assassins. These 6 assassins are members of a Bosnian radical youth movement known as Mlada Bosna, or Young Bosnia, one of whom is Gavrilo Princip. 5 of them are positioned at certain points along the motorcade's officially designated route, while the group's leader, Danilo Ilic, moves between them, offering encouragement.
They know of the planned itinerary for the day. They know the route that the convoy will take. In fact, Gavrilo Princip read about the planned event in the newspaper and decided upon reading that this was the opportunity perhaps to try and go through with this assassination plot. Now, assassinations weren't that unusual at the time. There are several examples of kings or politicians being assassinated all over Europe, and there were several attempts also made on Austro-Hungarian politicians and even the Emperor Franz Joseph. So it's not that unusual, and there had also been some warnings that possibly this was not going to be a trip without incident, but nonetheless the trip went ahead.
As you can imagine, the crowd is reported to being fairly jubilant. There's an air of festivity in the air. Franz Ferdinand himself is viewed as something of a symbol of hope, certainly not among everyone, but among certain groups, particularly with his promise of greater autonomy within what was still a fairly authoritarian and restrictive system.
They drove from the Filipovic barracks towards Sarajevo. When they got there, they went along the embankment of the Milachka River, which was on their right. To their left were the buildings of Sarajevo, the tall buildings of Sarajevo. A few yards along the embankment, at the Kumerch Bridge, one of the assassins threw a bomb at Franz Ferdinand's car.
Being a convertible, however, the grenade bounces off the collapsed roof and rolls under the car following them, where it explodes, injuring the passengers inside. The royal car then speeds away to the Sarajevo City Hall. At the City Hall itself, this is around just before 10:45, there's kind of uproar and commotion. The chief of police, for example, is urging the Archduke to remain inside the building with his wife, who's accompanied him on this visit. However, Oskar Potiorek, the overly ambitious governor, waves this away. He even refuses to have the local garrison mobilised on account of them not having dress uniforms. Franz Ferdinand himself also is somewhat of the architect of his own fate, in that he insists on getting back in the car and travelling to the hospital to visit those who'd been injured.
But it's arranged to change the route, because the route had been advertised previously, so it would be clear that any other assassins would know which route the car would likely take. So they decide to change the route, but unfortunately, an oversight, not all of the drivers were told of this change of plan. And so Franz Ferdinand's car actually still takes initially the originally arranged route across the Latin Bridge. The driver is then alerted to the mistake, tries to reverse the car and stalls it. And it just so happens that this stalling of the car and the reversing happens just where a third assassin, Gavrilo Princip, a third potential assassin, had positioned himself.
At which point, Princip draws his pistol, fires 2 shots, hitting the Archduke in the neck and his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, in the abdomen.
The bullet had gone into his jugular vein. There was blood everywhere. There was blood spurting from there, blood spurting out of his mouth. They had to cut open his uniform to actually get to the wound. He was still alive at this point, but only just. One of his aides asked him if he had any message for the children, and he was unable to reply. He died a few minutes later. Then they paid some attention to Sophie, and they discovered that unfortunately she was dead. She probably died in the car.
Princip and his co-conspirators are arrested at the trial, which took place in October 1914. There are 25 individuals who are indicted. So while there is just this small group of assassins dotted around Sarajevo on the day, it was a slightly larger operation, all told, of people who supplied weapons, who enabled the would-be conspirators to enter the country and shelter them, and so on. Princip, because he was too young to be sentenced to death, as he was under 20, received a 20-year jail sentence and died during the war in prison.
Austria-Hungary is really angry with Serbia. And there was an awful lot of sympathy around Europe for what had happened. Franz Ferdinand had quite a few friends in Europe. His best friend was the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, and he was horrified, shocked, appalled. They'd spent a lot of time in the last few years together. Most of Europe was shocked, especially at the assassination of a woman. Most of Europe did not see it as a cause for war. It was only really Austria-Hungary exaggerating it.
And then you also start to see growing calls for the Serbian government to explain itself. The Austro-Hungarian press, for example, publishes a litany of testimonies, including from Princip, that go against those appearing in the Serbian press, that stipulate that the young men were in fact deranged, suffering from various mental health issues, whereas the reports in the Austro-Hungarian press stipulate that no, Princip was very calm. He clarified his position very clearly, stating that his mission was to assassinate Franz Ferdinand and Potiorek in a bid to gain independence for Bosnia-Herzegovina and all of the southern Slavic peoples, so not just Serbs, but also Bosnians, Croats, and Slovenes, etc. I would say this doesn't necessarily provoke a sort of drift to war, because in reality, Austro-Hungary and Serbia were already in a sort of frozen war footing.
63-ton Stalin tanks, infantry and truck-mounted Katyushas spearhead the assault.
Since 1913, for example, Hungary had mobilized the army. Vast swathes of the Hungarian territory had been under martial law, much of which has been directed against its own Serbian minority. So really the reaction of the Austro-Hungarian government, I would say, was more one of effectively moving towards escalating an already volatile situation.
The immediate reaction in Austria-Hungary to the assassination was one of outrage. This was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, so Franz Ferdinand would have been the next emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was a direct attack on the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and also would have been seen as undermining Austria-Hungary's great power status. So outwardly, an outpouring of grief for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, even though behind the scenes, actually, there are some voices, people who are secretly quite pleased because Franz Ferdinand hadn't been widely popular, a difficult character. Some people felt that he had stood for peace, and the fact that he'd now been assassinated opened perhaps the possibility of war, where previously he had cautioned against it. Others felt that he had really encouraged the different nationalities within the Austro-Hungarian monarchy to have more rights, and that therefore, had he lived, he might have been, well, not exactly bad news for the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, but that he might have instigated reforms that not everybody agreed with. So outwardly concern and grief, but behind closed doors, some people were secretly not that disappointed to have lost Franz Ferdinand. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand offers the government in Vienna a reason or a pretext for what they describe as a reckoning with Serbia. Some members of the government, particularly the military, have been wanting to go to war with Serbia for some time, and this offered them a golden opportunity. What they needed was support from Germany, which in the past, in previous crises, had not always been forthcoming. On this occasion, possibly because the victim was a close friend of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he was genuinely outraged at this act of regicide, the German government offers full support. So the circumstances around an assassination with potentially Serbian involvement and the support from the most important ally, Germany, meant that this was a golden opportunity to deal with the Serbs once and for all, as one of the members of the government put it at the time.
I would describe the assassination as serving as a catalyst for accelerating pre-existing trends. Really, since the overthrow of King Alexander in 1903, relations between the Kingdom of Serbia and Austro-Hungary had been deteriorating at a very rapid pace. So we already have this sort of deteriorating Cold War-like situation between both these countries. This is very much seen as an opportunity to further their agendas, bearing in mind both of these countries are deeply embedded within the wider international framework of alliances. Germany and France, for instance, had both been competing for influence in Serbia prior to 1914. Russia sort of deems itself as kind of the quote-unquote protector of the Slavic peoples in the Balkans. So again, I think it's important to stipulate that the July crisis, the sort of diplomatic negotiations that break out, that begin really after this, following the assassination, is not so much a reflection of attempts to avert war, as it is a sort of wider indication of how degraded the international system was, and how this was essentially a system that was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions.
Austria-Hungary decided that it would send a note demanding various things to Serbia, things like putting in place Austro-Hungarian officials to supervise things in Serbia, getting rid of any officials that opposed Austria in any way. It was, as Sir Edward Grey as a British Foreign Office said, a very stunning and uncompromising note, something that he'd never seen one independent country send to another. Now, it took them a good time to do this as well. Franz Ferdinand was assassinated on the 28th of June. It was the 23rd of July when they got round to sending this to the Serbian government. And then they said, basically, sort this out. We will need an answer by 1800 on the 26th of July. And if we don't get the answer we want, we will break off diplomatic relations. Serbia replied in time, and it was an interesting reply. They fudged a lot of things, not quite agreeing, giving away a few bits and pieces, arguing about other things. It was a note that didn't really commit them to anything. It was a reply that did not really commit them to anything. On seeing the reply, the Kaiser said, "Oh, well, nobody's going to go to war on this." But on seeing the reply, the Austrian ambassador in Vienna packed his bags and was on the train out of Serbia at 18:30 that day. So basically, they were kind of the Austrians knew they were going too far. The Austrian ambassador knew they were going too far. They knew this was going to push the Serbians to war. And that's what happened. On the 28th of July, a month to the day, the Austrians declared war on Serbia.
Once the great armies had met head-on, the conflict resolved itself into a desperate struggle to hold this plot of ground, this foot of earth. Military analysts called it positional warfare. But the foot soldiers knew it only as a war of trenches, a desperate fight for a waterlogged hold.
Without the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, there wouldn't have been, in the summer of 1914, a trigger for war, a pretext or a cause that would have enabled the Austro-Hungarian government to want to go to war with Serbia, and that would have necessitated Germany supporting Austria-Hungary in the way that it did during the July crisis. So certainly without the assassination of Franz Ferdinand at that time, I don't think war would have broken out in the summer of 1914. That said, a different crisis might well have been used as a pretext or as a reason for going to war later. So I'm not saying that had Franz Ferdinand decided to travel on a different day, there would have been no war in Europe after that date. However, it's worth thinking about what if the assassination had failed? What if Franz Ferdinand had survived? Some historians describe Franz Ferdinand as being essentially peace-loving, as being somebody who had opposed war while he was alive. So had he survived, might he have counselled that a political, diplomatic solution to this event would have sufficed? There is disagreement over how peaceable Franz Ferdinand actually was. He's often been painted as this tragic figure as a result of the assassination, and because this event is generally seen as the start of the First World War, the cause of the First World War.
Obviously, it's likely that the situation would probably not have escalated to the extent that it did. Nevertheless, I am quite sceptical that the world would really have looked all that much different, certainly in this early 20th century period. Just to take one example, in Britain, the British cabinet at the time, the government of Herbert Asquith, when they were delivered news of the infamous ultimatum Austro-Hungary sent to Serbia in late July, what were they discussing at the time? It wasn't Europe, it was the prospect of rising sectarian violence in Ireland. Those tensions were not going to go away just because a radicalized Bosnian Serb student had failed to kill the heir presumptive to the throne of the Habsburg monarchy.
If there had been a war, the timing would there have been a war? There may well have been a war. I predict that there would have been probably just the one world war, not the two world wars, because the one world war, Hitler would probably not have come to power out of one world war, because it would have just been a bit later. So Hitler wouldn't have been the right man the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. So Hitler would not have come to power. Without Hitler coming to power, you wouldn't have had the Holocaust. Without the Holocaust, you might not have had an independent state in Israel. And without an independent state in Israel, would we have the problems that we've got in the Middle East now? That's a huge trajectory.
If Gavrilo Princip had realized the consequences of his action, which went so far beyond an act of violence against two individuals, he likely would not have pulled the trigger, because the consequences of his action, the consequences of the First World War, are still being felt today. It is certainly right to consider the First World War the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, had he not pulled the trigger, and had there been no other pretext for starting a war in or around 1914, then we wouldn't have had the First World War. And I think then the world would be a very different place if we accept that the outcomes of the First World War, the results of that war, led to Bolshevik Revolution, led to the Second World War, the Cold War. Without any of that, we would be in a very different place. Yeah, we can still see conflict all around us today, and all of those conflicts really, if you think about the Middle East, for example, are a result of the First World War. And if you want to take that leap back then to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, are a result of the actions of this 17-year-old boy.
The lessons that modern society can draw from the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is to stop, think, not go to war, always negotiate, look for the peaceful solution. Franz Ferdinand would have said that himself. Franz Ferdinand would have been appalled that his death caused the outbreak of World War I.